Initial warning, this book review contains true crime material, so there is more graphic content in this book review. In 1985, a woman by the name of Helen Wilson went to bed one evening feeling a little under the weather in the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska. The next morning, she was discovered bound and murdered in her apartment, having been sexually assaulted. This shocked the community that she came from. Helen Wilson had no enemies. She was an older woman. She lived next door to family members, so it was shocking that this would happen to her. And the town grappled with bringing the person who had done this to Helen Wilson to justice. Unfortunately, and unbeknownst to the town at that time, this was not going to be the only injustice committed with regard to Helen Wilson. As I am reviewing today, Failure of Justice, A Brutal Murder, An Obsessed Cop, 6 Wrongful Convictions by John Ferak. This was a very difficult but a very important read, I think, for all of us to read. So I'm going to be reviewing this book today, discussing the case of Helen Wilson, as well as my thoughts and opinions on this book overall. So in 1985, Helen Wilson turns up dead, having no apparent enemies with no known motive for murder. Some important case notes to keep in mind: no money was taken from her apartment, and there was quite a bit available in the apartment, so it did not appear that robbery was going to be a motive. Initially, and of course from the start, having no known enemies, not being engaged in high-risk behavior, there doesn't seem to be any reason for anyone to do this other than the part previously mentioned, the sexual assault part of this case. That seems to have been the motive, and the police force in the town of Beatrice, Nebraska, are not really equipped to handle something like this. But they need to bring peace and resolution, and they also need to bring justice in this case, so they begin working on it. Initially, there is a prime suspect. Someone brings up the name Bruce Allen Smith. Someone says that he had several incidents previous in that evening where he had been attacking young women, and a associate of him said that he saw Smith the next day with scratches on his face, and he was dropped off the night before in the vicinity of Wilson's apartment. So the police think that they are onto something. They also have a group working the crime scene where they take samples of the different DNA, or DNA was not being used at the time, but different evidence samples from the crime scene, and they are trying to track down who could do this. But very quickly, things become derailed. So the first thing to know is that there was a blood type B, found at the crime scene. This being in the 1980s, DNA profiling wasn't available at that time, so they were working with things like blood type. And the investigators were quickly tracking down Bruce Allen Smith. He seemed like a prime suspect. He seemed to have had problematic instances previous that night, and he was last seen that evening in the vicinity of Helen Wilson's apartment, having said cryptic messages about getting some at whatever cost or no matter what that evening. So they track him down, and they're looking for a blood type B with a special property called non-secretor. Or, yes, it was a non-secretor, which means, if I remember correctly, the blood type would not be found in like saliva or semen, or that is a non-secretor. So they're looking for someone with that blood type, and the blood type for Bruce Allen Smith comes back as blood type B, so a match in that regard, but he doesn't have the right secretion category for what was found in the crime scene. The cops quickly rule him out as a suspect. They say because his blood type didn't match, they need to start looking at other options, but there truly are no suspects. There were no witnesses, no one in the apartment heard anything, and it's really puzzling because, again, she had no known enemies. This wasn't someone involved in what we would consider a high-risk lifestyle. So they're at this is a cold case. This becomes a backlog in which they have to really wait and see what happens, and there's not much that can be done. And of course, this hurts and frustrates the family, who just want justice for their murdered mother, their murdered sister, their murdered aunt, however they are related to her. This is where the book really kicks off, and where, if this hadn't been solved, it would have been a cold case, or giving DNA advances, there may have been a resolution to this, but this case took a very interesting turn, and interesting in a bad way. I don't mean to make light of what happened. Enter an individual named Cersi. Cersi is it's Bert Cersi. Cersi, his last name, is how I'm going to be referring to him as. He was previously a cop with the Beatrice Police Department, and he goes on and off different police forces throughout his years. But most importantly, at the time where he enters the story, he is not a police officer. He decides that he's going to take it upon himself to investigate Helen Wilson's murder. Now, this could be a very noble case, and the problem is he starts acting as though he does have the right to question people. And he quickly comes up with what he believes to be a confidential informant, a woman by the name of Lisa Podendorf. I believe that's how you say her last name. She also went by the name Lisa Brown. I believe that is her married name, or Podendorf's her married name and Brown was her maiden name. Anyways, she was 17 at the time of the murder, and she claimed that a woman by the name of Joanne Taylor told her the day after the murder took place at around 7 in the morning that she needed money to get out of town because she was connected to the murder that had just happened of Helen Wilson. Now, this immediately raises suspicions. Why didn't Lisa Podendorf come to the police or any other investigatory agencies with that information in the last 4 years, and why was she telling Bert Cersi? I believe the book also mentions that Lisa Podendorf was not well liked. She had a contentious relationship with Joanne, so it's a little interesting that she would come forward with damning evidence 4 years later. Bert Cersi takes this witness as gospel truth, and he starts to build a case against Joanne Taylor and different people that she had bumped into throughout her life. So Cersi, operating outside of the police department's bounds, starts to follow this lead and treat it like gospel truth. And something to keep in note too is the FBI had been brought in at the beginning, and they made a profile of the individual who could have done this killing. Now, profiling, as far as I'm aware, is not an exact science, but it can kind of give you a clue as to who you might be looking for. In this case, they theorized it was a lone young 20s male who had a difficult relationship with women in his life, like his mother, who was acting alone, and the premise of the crime, as suspected, was the sexual assault and not necessarily robbery or anything else. But Cersi quickly seizes on his confidential informant's information and begins tracking down other people. He weaves this story in which Joanne Taylor, working with an individual named Joseph White, who she had come to Beatrice, Nebraska with, seeking to regain custody of her child, and other individuals like Thomas Winslow, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, were all placed at the scene of the crime. She is claiming that Bert Cersi starts digging up people like Lisa Podendorf, who claim to have seen the car being dropping people off, or seeing the car in the vicinity from a certain location. They're saying they're parked here and she's seeing the car with all these people get out. This doesn't match the FBI profile of an individual working alone, and it seems very confusing that we would have all these individuals in the apartment, with the apartment not being a big mess. So the apartment didn't appear to be trampled through or gone through, and it just seemed very, very odd. Bert Cersi decides that he's going to start questioning these individuals that he believes is guilty. He winds up finding Thomas Winslow, who is in prison actually at the time, and he's in there for beating an individual in Lincoln, Nebraska with a crowbar in a robbery gone wrong. Something to keep in mind is all of the individuals fingered by Bert Cersi are not necessarily what you would think of as upstanding members of society. They have criminal history in their past, and yeah, they're not perfect individuals. So I think that kind of contributed to maybe a predisposed bias in the population against these individuals. They had problematic pasts and they had committed crimes in the past. However, committing a crime in the past does not mean you are guilty of a crime in the future. And just because you've committed one crime does not mean you are guilty of another crime. So you have to be proven to be guilty of the crime that you have committed. Cersi begins looking for his people, and when he finds people, he starts telling them, along with a police psychologist, that they have repressed memories. He also tells them things like they have enough proof to place these individuals at the scene of the crime. He then threatens them with the electric chair unless they agree to speak, testify in this hand, and take a plea deal that says that they are guilty. So we have a bunch of witnesses who, all of them initially proclaiming they do not remember anything about the instance, they were not there, they had nothing to do with Helen Wilson's murder. And yet they're all taken and assumed to be guilty. Cersi tells them they have enough evidence to find them guilty, and that he will be attempting to get them sentenced to death by the electric chair in Nebraska unless they begin to testify. Another thing to note is there are a lot of vulnerable individuals. Joanne Taylor, I believe she suffered from a variety of mental illnesses. She was unstable. Another individual, Deborah Sheldon, was known to not have a high mental function. I forget exactly how they phrased it, but it's implied that she's maybe developmentally disabled or has some sort of learning disability. And so she actually begins to earnestly believe that she was there and has repressed memories of this situation. Of course, also all these individuals are confessing under duress. They believe that they will be executed, and even though they're being told that they have enough evidence to place them at the crime and they will be executed by the electric chair. Obviously, they have to secure the conviction, but the police make enough of a show with this police psychologist that some of them begin to turn. Actually, all of them turn eventually, besides Joseph White. Another individual who's fingered in the crime is Kathy Gonzalez, and this is where stuff begins to get interesting because there quickly became a hole in the theory. First of all, no one remembers what's happening at the crime. It's very clear Cersi is prompting the people he's questioning and getting to get a plea deal into giving the correct answers. For example, one of them says they met Wilson at a house, and then Cersi stops a tape recorder, and then when he turns the tape recorder back on, the witness is now saying that they met Wilson at an apartment. So clearly they're having to be coached in what to say. And in all of these witnesses too, and all of these suspects as well, none of them have blood type B. And remember, of course, and this is kind of a graphic detail, but there was a sexual assault on the scene, and none of the men have blood type B. So Cersi really needs to find someone with blood type B. And that's where Kathy Gonzalez comes in. He arrests Kathy Gonzalez, who's fingered, and at this point you really get the sense that people are just pointing fingers at anyone to get a plea bargain, to get on the stand, to avoid the death penalty. Or they're being promised they can get a lesser charge like second-degree murder or just an accessory and get out in quicker time. Kathy Gonzalez, lo and behold, has blood type B. But if you think for a second how Kathy Gonzalez, a woman, would provide blood type B evidence found in a sexual assault, things stop adding up. I also think it's a little ironic that Bruce Allen Smith, who was fingered in originally for the crime and had a lot of evidence pointing to him, had blood type B, but there was a problem with the secretion type, and that's why he didn't line up exactly. It was later found that the lab had done incorrect work, and we'll get back to that. But Kathy Gonzalez, who was blood type B, but could not have possibly contributed the semen that had the blood type B in it, she's fingered for, and the way that Cersi puts this together is that things just got mixed up with 6 people there. Of course, this is also blowing through the FBI profile, which doesn't necessarily have to be correct, but it seems very, very odd that, and they mention this, that a sexual assault would take place in the presence of so many female witnesses. They say that it's very unlikely, and it just seems odd that all of these people were there. So I think there is a section I want to read on page 326 that clearly explains why all these people were taking plea deals. If you thought that you were seriously facing the electric chair, but if you just signed agreeing to a plea deal, you could get less time, it's very clear that they might have it. So this is on page 326. Believe me, and this is a quote, "Believe me when I say that if you hold someone's life in your hands and you do when they are facing the electric chair, you are not inclined to persuade them to run the risk of dying when you have the ability to avoid that result, even if you suspect they are innocent. This would be hubris to the ultimate degree, and frankly, it is in my opinion that Joe's blood would be, to some extent, on my hands." This is a defense attorney, I believe, speaking, basically saying that even when the defense attorney believed their client was innocent, they're trying to secure the best result. And if the best result is, if one of the options on the table is death, and you have a sure way to mitigate removing the death penalty by having your client sign a deal, you can preserve at least their life by having them sign the deal, even if you don't truly believe they're guilty of the crime. And clearly through reading this book, it becomes clear that Cersi is prompting witnesses, he's concocting his own story, and he's forcing the evidence to fit his version of the crime, even when there's huge holes like Kathy Gonzalez having blood type B and yet not possibly being able to contribute the type of blood type B found at the crime scene. So the only individual who chooses to go to trial is Joseph White. He becomes convicted, obviously, and the evidence, even though the evidence doesn't seem strong against him, it convinces a jury that he is guilty, and he is convicted. He does avoid the death penalty, but he goes to life in prison forever. And you truly see why an individual would choose to avoid the death penalty and why these plea bargains are given, because it also sounds horrific for the family to have to sit through hours of testimony of the horrific last moments of a loved one's life. So you understand why that would be very, very hard as well. After Joseph White is convicted, Thomas Winslow, who is the last holdout, pleads no contest, but I do not believe he admitted guilt. He's just saying no contest and accepting his penalty. One way is you don't want to drag the people through the trial again, but another way of looking at this is he saw what happened to Joseph White. Why risk the electric chair when you can just sign to go to prison? Well, that's what seems to be the end of the story. Cersi becomes a local hero. He's solved this case and the family has justice. But this is where things get interesting, because Joseph White never admits to his guilt. He maintains that he is innocent in prison, and after a new law goes on the books allowing DNA to be retested in old cases after DNA evidence has been expanded, White requests that the DNA from the crime scene be tested. He wants that to be tested. He wants to be proven innocent. And the DNA, when tested, reveals that it is not White's. It is not Winslow's. In fact, the DNA does not belong to a single of these 6 individuals. They are to be exonerated. After a long case of Gage County, obviously that's the county that's happened, and obviously wants to keep the conviction because now it looks really bad. It basically comes out after DNA testing, and they attempt after the DNA testing to send all the evidence in to find any DNA evidence of any of these 6 convicted for murder are guilty. They are not. Congratulations. Gage County has now put 6 innocent of this crime individuals in prison, and they are now exonerated. They get their pardons, and they actually wind up getting a large settlement. Unfortunately, this isn't really the end of justice, because there was such a focus on these 6 individuals. They now start to look for who could have done this crime. You know who did the crime, or at least you know whose DNA matches what was found on the scene? Bruce Allen Smith. And this is where I really think things get really frustrating, because Bruce Allen Smith, by the time this was revealed, was no longer alive. He never had to stand to face justice for his part in the crime. And we can argue that maybe he never would have, because of that initial botched crime result saying that his blood didn't match close enough to what was found on the crime scene to be a match. And so maybe he would have gotten away with it anyways. But the fact that 6 people, and no matter what pardon, no matter what money you give them, they can never get that time back. Those 6 people had to spend time in jail or in prison for a crime they did not commit, and they lost years of their life. They lost time they can never get back. They lost time with children, with spouses. They lost their jobs, and their reputation has basically been tarnished due to Cersi and his overenthusiasm to solve a crime. So I do think it's also interesting about that blood type, where again they ruled Bruce Allen Smith out because of a discrepancy in the blood type B, but they let Kathy Gonzalez go to the prison for having blood type B, for not even being able to contribute to the sexual assault, essentially. Not that women can't commit sexual assault, but the nature of this crime, Kathy Gonzalez was clearly not going to be doing that sort of crime. She could have murdered, but everything else. I think this book is very important to read because it shows that how you could get a false confession out of someone. It shows that people falsely confess because they believe their life is in danger. They believe that they are not going to they're not going to live if they don't plead guilty. And you see how the prosecution, or not necessarily the prosecution, Cersi and his police psychologist actually manipulated the suspects into saying what they wanted. I think one of the other victims is clearly the Helen Wilson's family. Helen Wilson's family never got to see the true people stand up for justice. They thought they had peace for 10, 20 years when these people were behind bars, only to have it blown in the face, for them to be told that they sat through trials where horrific details were revealed about their loved ones' last moments, only to find out that those people who went to prison weren't it, and they got the wrong people. That really disrupts the healing process, and I think it's also just important to talk about the implications of this. Now, I don't want to get into deep divisions about what's right or what's wrong, but there are individuals who really had to take a hard look at the justice system following this conviction. For example, there seems to have been a bias that because these people weren't necessarily let's call them upstanding citizens, there was maybe a little bit more weight on their guilt. If this was just 3 men and 3 women from the local church choir who sent their kids to school and never had a brush with the law, then you get the sense that maybe it would have been harder to convict them. But because these were people, there was one individual who was involved in the adult entertainment industry. One of the individuals, Taylor, had lost custody of her children. She clearly suffered from mental illness. There was different challenges with substance abuse. So when you start adding that up, these are the kind of people who maybe it's easy to apply a bias to. Another thing to keep in mind is, and this has changed, people in this book are mentioned as having changed their stance on death, the death penalty, because we can see how easy it is to get this wrong. Or not easy, I don't want to say easy, but you can see how things can go wrong and the wrong person could have faced death penalty for something they didn't do. It's also very frustrating to see how close the police came initially to nabbing the right person, and the individual who was in charge of the first lab results actually wound up being terminated from her position because she had a long history of doing the lab results wrong, resulting in horrible outcomes for a lot of people, as we are shown here. They could have gotten Bruce Allen Smith, and clearly all the evidence points to him at the very beginning, but when one lab result rules him out, they're left at, the police force is left at a dead end, and that's where Cersi can come in and start manipulating. It is, I feel like, a big question why Lisa Podendorf lied. It was later proven that she couldn't have had the story of events as she told them. Now, maybe she misremembered times, but she is claiming that there were police at the apartment before Helen Wilson's body had been discovered, where she claims she was sitting when she saw certain things occur in the evening. There was no direct line of sight. Maybe she misremembered, but I feel like there's more questions about the confidential informant that Bert Cersi conjured up that need to be answered as well. And I think, yeah, never seeing the person who committed a crime face justice has got to be a hard thing for the family to deal with. And they clearly have a lot of anger resulting from this whole situation. A book that I wanted to compare this book to as well, because I actually don't really like consuming a lot of true crime. I think a lot of it is very sensationalist, and if you really want to have a mystery of whodunit, why not just read a fictional book? I don't think it's very ethical to profit off the excitement of someone else's horrific crime. But I do think there is a place for true crime that's done well, and that's when true crime can explain a problem in the justice system, can highlight a fault, can maybe bring light to a case that wasn't handled correctly, or to tell an important development in the way that society works. And I think DNA evidence has really been a massive, massive breakthrough for crime. I know they caught, who was it, the Golden State Killer was one of the first ones who were caught, or I want to say one of the first major cold cases that was solved using DNA evidence. There was that individual in New York who had murdered women on, I believe, Long Island, who was caught because he dropped a pizza in the trash. The book that I read was Silent Witness, where a man was caught and convicted of killing 2 teenagers who were on a road trip in Washington. And so I think that this book follows in the footsteps, because without that DNA review, they never would have been able to overturn their convictions, or I don't think it would have been possible for them to overturn the convictions. And so I think this, and also the idea that these people could be forced or coerced into giving a false confession, is very, very important to understand when looking at true crime cases. That just because someone confesses, if they confess under the right circumstances, such as being threatened with death, with the death penalty, and being told that they have enough evidence to convict you to get that death penalty unless you sign this piece of paper, I think it's important to understand how someone could be coerced into that sort of situation. Overall, even though this is a long book, it's like 450 pages, I think Failure of Justice is a must read. It definitely at points reads a little, I would say, not casual, because it's not really a casual crime. At one point, the author uses the phrase subhuman sicko to describe the individual who perpetrated this crimes, which I'm not saying I disagree with, but it doesn't feel like something that would get through a major publishing house with that sort of language. So it does feel a little more, I'm using the word casual because I'm not sure what else to use in that sense, but I think it is a great read for anyone interested in psychology or how false confessions can be obtained, as well as DNA breakthrough and how that pertains to true crime. And I think John Ferak did an excellent job with Failure of Justice. If you've read this book or have any thoughts, please put your thoughts in the comment section down below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of